Looking at the image on the screen that is being presented on the left-hand side, starting from the bottom, we see the call to Metatron that I described last week, and a statement underneath it. The statement is, mind becomes Metatron. This tears through the idea of separate entities, or what Pseudo-Dionysus calls a denial of all beings. It doesn't mean that beings don't appear. They certainly do, just as things and places and times and ideas appear. The question is, what is their essence? Contemplative mysticism is concerned with essentiality, because only when phenomena is rooted in an understanding of essentiality can its meaning be expressed outright without eluding us behind a veil of conceptuality. So the means whereby this can be accomplished, one way that this can be accomplished, is by the mind merging with the wisdom field, by calling the wisdom essence of Metatron. Mind falls through this call in a sense that one would fall into a state or into a condition or into a set of patterns. Mind falls into those patterns and loses itself, loses its own composure. You could say that conceptuality, which is based on memory, and those memories form associative patterns and the conventional worldview that is shared between beings. This is the type of intelligence that the body-mind relies upon to get its bearings under normal circumstances. When the mind seeks out the wisdom field and falls into it, gives itself over to it, nullifies its own separateness to it, it assumes the identity of what it falls into because the prior state of identity passes away or dissolves. This represents a new kind of intelligence, a new kind of mind, where the mind as we know it, which is generally the psyche, which thinks and feels, discovers its own essence. The mind meets itself in this falling. And if the mind meets itself, what else is there other than itself? Like you could say that in a conventional sense, you have two things. You have the mind and its sense of identity as one thing, and this wisdom proposition, which is something else. When the two meet each other, is it really two things meeting each other? If the wisdom essence is already the essence of the mind, underlying all its patterns, its habituations, the mind meeting itself erases the sense of separation or division between the two. And thus, the mind becomes the wisdom field, falls into the wisdom field, becoming the wisdom field, assuming the wisdom field. The mind becomes Metatron. Now, this does not mean that you, the identity of the body-mind, become the identity of an angel called Metatron. That is completely from start to finish a conventional proposition. When occultists hear Metatron, they think an angel, usually corresponding to Keter, a being, maybe a sublime being, but a being nevertheless. If you do that with Metatron, you do it to yourself. If you do it to yourself, you do it with Metatron. If the goal is for that aspect of reification and division to fall away, then something entirely different happens. The mind, which is usually, from our point of view, discursive conceptuality, the formation of mental constructs of thought and feeling, speculative, sensory, what have you. When that discursive conceptuality imputes identity on itself, and that is given away, surrendered, sacrificed, you could say, into the wisdom field through the name Metatron, it's not that there's anybody there to receive the falling. Metatron is the aperture, the passageway, the gate, literally functioning as the Ibri gate, the state of passage from a lesser condition, which is always reflexive and dualistic, into a greater condition, which is non-dual. And in this falling into the wisdom field, the mind meets itself. The vessels that we call naran, nefesh, ruach, neshama, meet the essence of their own awareness, which is the ground of all phenomena, which is Or Ein Sof, through Metatron, which wields the flaming, rotating sword that cuts through all barriers. Up at the top of the left-hand side of the image on the screen here is a little explanation of how conceptuality works. I've been over this before. It's certainly beyond the scope of the time allotted today to go through it, but you can refer to it in the PDF. The most important thing here is picking up where we left off last week, where the call to Metatron is this falling through. And the means of the falling through is rather elusive. It's really not based on the intellectual aspect of contemplation, but the devotional aspect. That it's impossible to complete this, what we would call transaction, from conventionality into wisdom. If you don't love wisdom, it is most definitely based on love. Love is the means, love is the goal, love is the realization. That if you don't love the sublime, love the promise of the sublime nature of things, the as yet undiscovered country, as Shakespeare says in Hamlet about death, the undiscovered country. The undiscovered country, to a conventional being as death, as Shakespeare put it, can be applied by the same token to wisdom. We don't know what it is before we've realized it. It's undiscovered by us. The process of that discovery is the sacrifice of everything that is constrictive and reductive or lesser through this agency of Metatron, which makes this promise of Metatron's wisdom field profoundly precious and a thing worthy of love, worthy of devotion. And this devotional intelligence informs our being in a very direct way through new kinds of thought and feeling, which are contemplative modes of thought and feeling. Okay, so through this agency, as the mind meets itself, meets the essence of its own awareness, you have a kind of a mirror-like state arising, where what is reflected in the mirror, which is what you think you are, meets the reflection, which is what arises, and in the meeting of these seemingly two things that are engaged in a reflective relationship, the nature of the mirror shines through and encompasses or swallows both of them. This is very much like the proposition that is given to us in the Fountain of Wisdom. Aleph, numerical value 1, is never less than 2. So if Aleph is never less than 2, and 2 always arise, it seems as there it could be an identity surrendering and a wisdom field accepting it. But in the midst of that relationship, something incredible happens. And this incredible transmutation I refer to as the lightning flash. It is beyond increments. It's beyond process mechanics. It's beyond stages of transformation. It is an instantaneous, spontaneous realization of the mirror's nature. First, we approach the mirror as a thing being reflected, a thing encountering a reflection, which is another thing. If there are two things, that which is being reflected and the reflection itself, you don't know what the mirror is. You're still focused on the effects of a cause. But the lightning bolt of a causality which acts as the flaming, rotating sword, tearing through the architecture of that arrangement, allows the nature of what is reflective to outshine the division between the parts that are then reified and divided conventionally. And that realization, that lightning flash realization, is the wisdom itself. And the mirror as the function of the ground becomes clear. And that's the main point. Onward and upward here. Okay. Now, the nature of that mirror that I'm speaking about is implied surreptitiously in the divine name associated with Keter. How so? This is not explained in the Bible or in most Kabbalistic commentaries. Where does it come from? Well, you got our boy Moses. He's standing in front of the burning bush, and he basically says to the miracle of the bush that is not consumed, who shall I say did this, sent me? Who are you to the divine? And the answer is Ehya Asher Ehya, which you see on the screen here. That being the complete name attributed to Keter, usually reduced to just the name Ehya, but Ehya Asher Ehya is the statement that the name Ehya is derived from. Usually, it's mistranslated as I am that I am. That's not exactly correct in the Hebrew language. Doesn't really matter. It's a fine point, but the real translation should be future tense potential. I shall be, or I will be what I will be. I prefer I shall be that by which I shall be. It doesn't really matter. There's many issues having to do with this name that we're not going to talk about today. What is most relevant today is the fact that this is a mirror-like arrangement. You have the name Ehya reflecting itself. Again, Aleph, never less than 2. You can have this precept and stick with the dualistic divisions into infinity, and it will not correct itself. The correction comes with the lightning flash. The correction comes when the view shifts from relationships between parts, such as the two main parts of a thing being reflected in a mirror and the reflection in the mirror, and reflectivity itself. And almost the entire text of the Fountain of Wisdom is based on this, patterns of reflection, the nature of what makes those patterns appear being the point, rather than just a calculation of the patterns in their networks. So I call your attention to a line from the Fountain of Wisdom, which I've written on the lower right portion of the screen here. And what it states is, the marvelous light, which is attributed to Keter, I just put Keter here because it makes more sense. Keter is a mirror in which everything is seen. That's the primordial mirror of phenomena that we're addressing here. The marvelous light receives exchange from the light darkened from illuminating. Well, the light darkened from illuminating is the ground, of course. That's the Or Ein Sof. I am quite fond of saying that its dynamic aspect is a what we could call a luminous darkness, and its capacity to present itself as an open field in which structures appear is a dark luminosity. A luminous darkness and a dark luminosity are the aspects of Chokhmah and Bina. They're sort of interchangeable, and sometimes I do interchange them. But the idea that darkness and light are not dualistic, separate entities, but are the same thing seen from two different sides of the mirror, so to speak. That this light, darkened from illuminating, it is dark because it is unknowable. It illuminates because it's the essence of awareness that knows. So if the essence of awareness that knows darkens itself by virtue of the fact that it's shining, that unknowable, brilliant essence is the mystery inherent in both that which knows and that which is known. Okay, that posits a kind of mirror-like relationship. And if this mirror is the mirror in which everything is seen, that's the marvelous light. That's the Keter. The reflections in this mirror are chazhazet. These are the eidolons, the shadows on the cave wall in Plato that are delineated by the throne of light, the Arafal and the Chashmal. We'll get into that in a minute here. But the most important thing is reconciling this mirror and this divine name. It is the mirror in which everything is seen, and all of its reflections are the sum total of states of being, both ontological and epistemological, what knows and what is known. Okay, so let's have a look at this name that describes this mirror-like function. I shall be that by which I shall be. Well, if we start out by saying I shall be, or even I am, if you want to use the slightly mistranslated version, I shall be or I am, a state of being asserted, to be, am, and the identity I. Well, right there you have the two errors that we know create the dualistic division within all phenomena. You have the epistemological error of awareness taking itself as separate and thereby reifying itself by calling itself I. That's your first mistake. And the state of its existence, the state of its being, which can even be reified to the opposite, to say that I am or I am not. You could reify I am not into a mental construct of absence, just as you can reify it into that which poses that it is in an aspect of presence. So whether it is or is not, you can reify it as a mental construct if you reify ontological status. So you have epistemological and ontological reification, I and be. So obviously, this is what the mind gravitates towards automatically by virtue of its habits. So this reflective double mistake, I shall be, reflects itself. So you have a double mistake reflecting a double mistake, and thereby reflecting itself as itself into infinity, on and on and on. This is the inevitable consequence of the mirror reflecting itself or shattering into infinite reflections that fragment into patterns and arise into fields that extend on forever. Aleph is never less than 2, reflects itself without end. And that's the field which is mirror-like in secret, but proposes itself as an infinite series of things that can be grasped, a grasping field in a network of infinite grasping fields. So what if we take the marvelous light, the mirror in which everything is seen, and we realize that it's actually in a different business than the chaotic entropy and fragmentation that we assume that it is by virtue of our habits? What if we take the fountain of wisdom at its word and take a look at the reflection of the ground receiving an exchange from itself. What is that exchange? Well, the exchange is just simply its function, which is a mirror-like function. When the shift is made from understanding the ground's mirror-like nature, when the shift is made to that, away from grasping at infinite reflections by that which knows the reflections, which itself is a reflection, right? Reflections within reflections within reflections forever. That's one view, an infinite entropic field of grasping, where subjects grasp at objects, that which knows grasps at that which is known, on and on and on forever. What breaks through that? What is the lightning flash that wields the flaming rotating sword and makes that view obsolete? Well, knowledge of the wisdom of the mirror. So when our boy Moses stands before the burning bush and says, okay, what are you, essentially? And the answer is, basically, I am this mirror. Well, what the Bible does is it leaves us in a conventional understanding of that arrangement, as if there is an ultimate cause that is the creator of an infinite series of effects, and that causal cascade of reflection goes on forever, and we worship it and its laws. That's the exoteric understanding of the mirror. And from the standpoint of religion, it is correct. The esoteric understanding of that gets into heretical territory because it not only undermines the reflection field as an infinite cascade of things to be beheld or grasped at, but it also undermines the identity of the creator, the ultimate cause. And this is where we get heretical in terms of Judeo-Christian theology. If you take away the identity both of the parts of the reflection and the cause of those parts, the whole causal scenario, and you cut through the ground as being without identity, then the mirror is just simply a function that is reflective by nature. And that can be realized when the question is asked, what is this? It's a mirror in which everything is seen. It receives an exchange. That exchange is reflective by nature. And realization of it is realization of our own awareness, which is utilized both in the act of perceiving, which is the actual practice that brings you to this conclusion, and all assumptions that we make about that which is perceived, which are infinite worlds of phenomena, infinite states of consciousness, infinite worlds of phenomena that contextualize what is found by consciousness. When you cut through that mirror at its core, at the highest level, at the level of Keter, at the root, you understand this exchange is just merely a function of its power. This is the essence of the creative wisdom itself. If this is what we understand the Ibri gate to be opening up to us, this is the passage from conventionality, personified by Metatron, by Melech Matat. That passage becomes the practice, and it's inherent in perceptivity, where we throw the one perceiving and the thing perceived into the fire to be consumed. And if we do so with devotion, with love for what is most essential, which is a very hard thing to do because it's so elusive and based on such a rare understanding of what's going on, that the willingness to abandon the whole framework of the logic of our being and knowing is very, very scary, very frightening to the human mind, because there's no net underneath it when it falls. It falls nowhere. It falls into nothing. When you take away that dualistic structure that holds conventionality up, you're in free fall. Literally, this is the fall into Metatron that comes with the call. When we call to Melech Matat, Amatat Shaddai Atah, it's with the sum total of our love for that mystery that we cannot grasp, cannot know. The things that can be said about it, it's being reflective, for example, should cut through some of the confusion when parts seem to arise in their entropy, in their different directions. But if we don't let what we think we are as knower and what we assume the known parts are as things that are known, if we don't let that structure fool us, then this name, Ehya, Asher, Ehya, just presents the mirror in which everything is seen, receiving its exchange from Or and Sof. And passage into that becomes the entirety of the practice. It's actually not that complicated. It's actually far simpler than we might think that it is. So, what's the takeaway message here? Well, the takeaway message is that through this call to Metatron, we have the final stages of the ladder that are described in the 13 Powers text being laid out for us. And what's difficult about it, and not easily understood just from a cursory reading of the 13 Powers text, is that there's a logic shift after the call to Metatron. It's hierarchical up to that point where you're cutting through layers, like we said in the first class and somewhat last week. But after the call to Metatron, the rest of these aspects are meant to be taken as a singularity that presents the mirror in its exchange, in its mode of function, to express the divine, to express the Or and Sof. And they're meant to be seen in their wholeness with one another, that we have the marvelous light, which is the aspect of Keter, the reflections in that marvelous light, in its mirror-like nature, which constitute the Chas Hazit. And then throne of light, Arafal, and Chashmal between them being the powers that delineate the specificity of the reflection as it arises in the mirror. So what does this actually mean? Well, the tendency through dualistic grasping is to see the reflections in the mirror as an endless series of things. So the Chas Hazit reflection will show one reflection, will change into something else, change into something else, change into something else, et cetera, et cetera. What happens when the reflection changes? What happens when the reflection in the mirror of phenomena becomes different? What happened to the previous one that we just grasped at? It's gone. So just like you could look at a picture of yourself when you're 5 years old and say, well, that's me. That's me at age 5. And now I'm like this. Well, what happened to that kid? Where did they go? That was you, I thought. So if it's you, the transformation poses this mystery of passage that states transform and previous modes of grasping just disappear. Well, there's some underlying condition that allows that to be possible. There's some underlying condition of openness, which has no image of its own, no reality of its own. It is completely open, like a mirror, which has no image of its own. So the reflections are in that open nature. The Chas Hazit is just realization that these fleeting reflections, the ever-changing reflections, are substanceless, completely without any solid, definitive basis, and are free floating in their openness in an ever-changing manner. Now, this is exactly the opposite of what we do with our assumptions about the world, which is essentially treat all phenomena as things. And substantiality is the basis of everything else that we reify in the habit field. And when I say things and substantiality, don't think I'm not talking about everything else, because we turn coordinate locations or a sense of place into a thing, into a mental construct. We turn moments in time into a thing, a mental construct of an instant becomes a unit in our mind that we think has certain qualities, and we store it as a memory, and we think that it's really a coherent constructs that we can refer to. We can think about that time frozen. Same with ideas. We treat our ideas conventionally like things. So whether it's a substance, a place, a time, or an idea, these are frozen, coagulated constructs within the mirror, or so we think. Now, the good news is that we can realize the nature of the mirror and cut through all that. The bad news is that everything that we know is just an endless series of parts that relate to each other in relationships, in networks of associative patterns that are all based on frozen memories. And that can allow us to do a number of things. It can allow us to calculate many aspects of what we think of as the so-called real world, to survive and protect territory and identity and form bonds and cohere relationships of various sorts. A majority of science is based off of demonstrable empirical observations of this type. But in mysticism, when the goal is to cut through to wisdom and fall through the gaping hole in this field of associative patterns, the express message is to stop treating all phenomena as a thing, to stop treating phenomena, substances, places, or the aspect of dimensionality, moments in time, or the aspect of temporality, and ideas or conceptuality itself, to stop creating things, units, frozen, coagulated parts with beginnings and ends, and feeding them into these both personal and collective networks of association that allow us to think we understand the meanings of all of this going on infinitely. So if we start out by saying that Chazhazit is a presentation of the reflections in the mirror of the marvelous light, then we could go through all these other stages of what we misinterpret as dimensionality and temporality and conceptuality, and understand them in the same way as reflections in this openness, in this pure potentialized field. The throne of light, otherwise known as the Klipa Noga, is really the delineating function of the reflections. It posits borders, and a border, like I've said before, separates this sense that something is being contained from the space around it, the negative and the positive aspects. What's in the state of containment we think is the thing. What surrounds the state of containment is uncontainable. It's not the thing. So it's a yes-no relationship. But what we find out through mystical exploration is that this territory, which poses itself as a border, is etheric in nature and can become permeable. And in that permeability, it opens into a kind of a glow that is really not so firm and distinct as we thought it was. That the separations between things, between places and times and ideas, and even our own identity, which we think is so solid. I mean, what's more solid than us, right? We're the ones calling the shots here. But when we look into these reflections in the mirror, we see that they're delineated in a very non-firm way. You'll never find the exact boundaries of the things that you think pose the boundaries. And that can be looked at and inquired about. And when one goes into this realm of the indistinct nature of limitations and borders and boundaries, one finds oneself in a thoroughly etheric territory in which there's a lot of bleed through from the inner aspects of things, which we see from the back, so to speak, and the front of those things, which faces the infinite. So the backs and fronts of things, when they start to become indistinct, give way to a kind of a collapse. And when the throne of light collapses and something more profound shines through, another term is used. Generally, I refer to that as the crystal seat. In other words, the delineations, the skins of things become clear, clear and bright, bright in their darkness and dark in their brilliance. And this allows us the ability to pass through action in a new way. And this is the realm of the Arafal, which is associated with time. Time is totally divorced from the solidity of things that we think are real in the sense of matter. Time is the process of change that's concordant with matter, but try to perceive time in and of itself. You can't do it. You could perceive what happens in a moment where things transform into other things, but you can't perceive the moment itself. You can't grasp it. Just can't do it. So the Arafal, which translates into a kind of a fog, is the fog of passage, that the passage that we associate with moments in time is really an extension of the throne of light, or the Klipa Noga opening up, where the reflections in the mirror that become permeable, instead of degenerating into mechanical processes, open up into a register all their own that is completely off limits to the intellect. It's felt far more than it is seen. And through the fog of that passage, the pure, clear, translucent, essential dynamism called chashmal sparkles through. And as I've said before, the word chashmal reduces to two subwords, chash and mal, speaking and silence. The speaking silence, the infinite that arises expressed through seemingly finite things. If the designation of thing in the conventional sense, meaning solid and separate, is opened up and its borders and boundaries become permeable, and the fog of passage between the instances of its seeming transformation allows you through, something of the thrust of the ground, the communicative wisdom thrust of the ground can be apprehended. That's the chashmal. That's the pure dynamism that allows the reflections to appear in the mirror of the marvelous light. So these are not five separate realizations, although they might seem to be stages in the explanation, the way that I'm talking about them, but they're, for the most part, apprehended spontaneously as a singularity. They all come together as a lightning flash. You can get little flashes or sparkles of different aspects of each one separately, but ultimately, when it coheres into realization, into gnosis, it is as a singular wisdom field. This is the wisdom field. This is the face of the wisdom field. And it doesn't happen anywhere else other than the apparent presentation of things, places, times, and ideas. which is where you are right now. It doesn't happen elsewhere. There's nowhere else to go. It is a shift in view that is completely and utterly radical, shifting beyond what both science and religion tells you is true.